I want to bring in Eugene Robinson, a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist at the Washington Post, and Mark Thompson, host of the Make It Plain podcast. We should note he's moderating the first ever presidential forum in historic Selma, Alabama this weekend. Nice to see you both.
Good to be here, Ari.
Hello, thank you.
You can understand if you spend enough money wanting to take a day at Disney World, can't you?
Sure.
I mean, it's a nice place.
Well, but more importantly, I think he probably wants to be isolated and studious and cram. Because Elizabeth Warren kind of lit him up in the last debate.
Does Mike Bloomberg need this fantasy time because the reality of that first debate it wasn't any fun?
Well, I'm sure it's just a comfortable place, but I doubt he's doing a lot of fantasizing or having a lot of fun. I wouldn't think so. If he is, he's probably making a big mistake because he needs to be prepared for the night.
When you look at what's shifting, Gene, you are a student and a chronicler of politics in Washington. Much of what happens there is arcane and intricate and powerful, and we need people who understand government to explain it. But much of what the Democratic Party elites have been saying in Washington seems to change week to week, and now suddenly they've woken up to the Sanders lead, which was not the focus of the last debate.
Duh, you know, I mean, they spent the entire debate going after the guy who has, you know, 0 delegates, who nobody has voted for, Michael Bloomberg, and almost completely gave Bernie Sanders a pass, and that was done. But, you know, I'm so reminded of 2016, frankly, on the Republican side, where you had Republican establishment conventional wisdom about how, first of all, Trump would never get off the ground, and then why we just need, if we could only just consolidate all the never-Trumpers into one candidate, and that would stop him. And meanwhile, he just continued on. And a dynamic that kind of reminds me of that is happening on the Democratic side right now. You saw the dissolution of the Republican establishment in 2016. And I think the Democratic establishment's not doing too well.
Well, and when we talk about the establishment, right, you have to define it. I explicitly mentioned the campaign consultants who profit off the race, who are giving out all this advice. Plenty of Democrats have now started working for Mike Bloomberg, as distinct from the people in offices. Because it's very interesting, Mark, as the Sanders surge has occurred, I'm not here to tell you whether he can beat Trump. I don't know. But I am here to tell you what the facts are. So when other people say, well, here's a new prediction, Trump can't win, Sanders can't win, this and that. If it sounds familiar and less than credible, that's because it is. So this is interesting reporting I want to ask you about with Senator Chris Murphy and other Democratic senators who spoke out in public, many under their own names, when Politico was reporting in a new piece. Senate Dems are not, quote, freaking out about Bernie. And it says more than a dozen senators say Sanders was not the electoral anchor critics make him out to be.
Well, I'm sure that's comforting to the Sanders campaign, and it makes some sense. There is a consultant class and sometimes a pundit class that's, yelling the sky is falling. But honestly, if anybody was that concerned, the so-called establishment or consultant class or what have you, seems to me they would start negotiating some other folk getting out of the race to consolidate votes, perhaps. But that's not happening. If we look at the so-called moderates, I guess that would be Klobuchar, Buttigieg, Biden, and Bloomberg, they're going to continue to split up the votes. And the longer they stay in the race, the person that some of them most fear, Bernie Sanders, is going to continue to amass delegates. Now, having said that, Bernie and anybody else would have to win the math says about 55% in every race from now on, because there's proportional representation in terms of delegate allocation. So you'd have to win 55% to get to the 1991 threshold before the convention. That being highly unlikely, I'm pretty sure we're looking at a broker convention.
Well, you're talking about whether the momentum kicks in behind someone or not. Bloomberg spending could clearly affect that. Both of you talking about whether the lessons of past cycles are being learned or not. And this is something that someone who worked for Jeb Bush, who was a well-known candidate who got beat by Trump, was talking about. I want to read from this 5 lessons from 2016 that Tim Miller argues Democrats should learn. For 2 straight debates, the non-Bernies focused on Mayor Pete rather than Bernie in Nevada. They did the same thing with Warren, disemboweling Mayor Mike and Pete, and Amy continuing their tiff. Gene.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what they did in the debates. You know, there is this idea that, if you could only get it down to Bernie and an anti-Bernie, right, then the anti-Bernie would win the nomination because there are more votes on that side. But that doesn't actually hold up to the data we have. I mean, there are polls. Morning Consult did a poll asking second choices. Well, you know, the #1 second choice of Biden supporters is Bernie Sanders. The fact is that voters don't look at these candidates as being, you know, precisely placed along this ideological spectrum that those of us who are perhaps closer to politics and have all this experience sort of see them on.
Right, and that they're looking for recognizable people to beat Donald Trump more than finding a point on the scale. I want to ask you both about one other thing. Take a listen to a colleague of ours from Time Magazine, Anand, who has talked a lot, quite forcefully, about the money and the challenges around a candidate who is probably not like every other candidate, Senator Sanders, and thus challenges some of the larger system that we have. Take a look.
We are starting to see that we may be paddling through a bend in the river of history here. Something is happening in America right now that actually does not fit our mental models. Every single vote Michael Bloomberg hopes to get is because of spending money on ads. In other words, the enterprise of the Bloomberg campaign, not some side activity of it, the enterprise of it as a whole is corrupt.
Not according to the Supreme Court. I mean, not according to our federal election laws. I mean, he can spend as much money as he wants on his campaign, and in fact, he has practically unlimited funds. He can spend more than any human being has ever spent on any election, you know, in human history. And he may, actually. I mean, he could stay in till the bitter end. He's offering himself as an alternative to Donald Trump, saying, I can beat Donald Trump. I will spend what it takes to beat Donald Trump. I may not be perfect for the Democratic Party, but here I am. I'm that option, and Bernie Sanders is not. This debate tonight could be fire between the...
Fire or fire emoji?
Well, okay.
Fire emoji being higher.
Yes,
fire.
right. It could be fire emoji. Okay, so if that's higher,
I think it's higher. I don't know what
because I mean I sense panic out there
about Sanders.
Well, imagine Bernie wins South Carolina. If he managed to win South Carolina, and he's got more momentum going into Super Tuesday, I think everybody would be discomfited by that.
And I think that the so-called establishment should consider that. Bernie Sanders could very well be the nominee, and people are going to have to deal with that. And it may just very well be the case. You can't, ads alone can't do it. Now, as far as Bloomberg beating Trump, what is he going to do in a debate if he could not survive Elizabeth Warren and Democrats a week ago? What's he going to do with Trump? In terms of Bernie beating Trump, you know, I think part of Bernie's popularity may be this, and part of his success may be this. Trump is unorthodox and just a shock in terms of what a norm would be. Bernie, to some extent, is the same. Obviously, he's somewhat unorthodox, and maybe people actually think it will take two pretty unique and extraordinary individuals to go head-to-head to resolve this.
But the one thing they have in common, they both inspired and are leading movements.
Yeah.
Trump led a movement. Bernie has a movement. And it may not be a majoritarian movement in the Democratic Party, but it's the only kind of movement out there right now that I see with that sort of passion and commitment. And that can mean a lot.
Yeah, and that's really striking coming from you, as mentioned, having witnessed these races before. And what do you do with what's happened in the past to keep an open mind to what voters are choosing? Because that's ultimately what democracy is, to state something fairly basic. Gene Robinson and Mark Thompson, my thanks to both of you. Very interesting.